The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ. Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 1, Side 2. It is by reference to these Pompeian paintings that connoisseurs have tried to understand the nature and classify the periods and styles of pictorial art in ancient Italy. The method is precarious, for Pompeii was more Greek than Latin. But what remains of classic painting in Rome and its suburbs falls in tolerably well with the Pompeian development. In the first or incrustation style, 2nd century B.C., walls were often colored to resemble inlaid marble slabs or crusti, as in the house of Sallust at Pompeii. In the second or architectural style, 1st century B.C., the wall was painted to simulate a building or facade or colonnade. Often the columns were represented as seen from within, and open country was pictured between them. In this way the artist gave to a probably windowless room cool vistas of trees and flowers, fields and streams, peaceful or playful animals. The imprisoned dweller could fancy himself in Lucullus's gardens by merely looking at the wall. He might fish or row or hunt or indulge a fondness for birds without suffering their untimeliness. Nature was taken into the house. The third or ornate style, AD 1 to 50, employed architectural forms purely for ornament and subordinated landscape to figures. In the fourth or intricate style, AD 50 to 79, the artist let his fancy riot, invented fantastic structures and shapes, placed them in positions gaily scornful of gravity, piled gardens and columns, villas and pavilions upon one another in modernistic disarray, and occasionally achieved the impressionistic effect of a picture supplemented by unconscious memory and suffused with light. In all these kindred styles, architecture was handmaid and mistress to painting, served it and used it, and gave body to a tradition that reawoke, after 16 centuries, in Nicolas Poussin. It is a pity that the subjects of the major extant paintings so seldom venture beyond Greek myth. We tire of these same gods and satyrs, heroes and sinners, Zeus and Mars, Dionysus and Pan, Achilles and Odysseus, Iphigenia and Medea, though a like charge could be brought against the Renaissance. There are a few pictures of still life, and here and there a fuller, an innkeeper, or a butcher shines on Pompeian walls. Love often dominates the scene. A girl sits brooding over some secret longing not unrelated to the Eros who stands beside her. Young men and women gambol amorously on the grass. Psyches and Cupids frolic as if the town had never known anything but love and wine. If we may judge from their representation in these murals, the women of Pompeii deserved to have life center about their comeliness. We see them engrossed in the game of knucklebones, or leaning gracefully over a lyre, or composing poetry with a meditative stylus at the lips. Their faces are quiet with maturity, their forms are healthily full, their robes fall about them with Phidian amplitude and rhythm. They walk like Helens, conscious of their divinity. One of them performs a Bacchic dance, apparently in thin air. Her right arm, hand, and foot are as lovely as anything in the history of painting. Some male characters must be included with these masterpieces. Theseus, victor over the Minotaur, Hercules rescuing Deianira or adopting Telephus, Achilles angrily surrendering the reluctant Briseis. In this last picture, every figure nears perfection, and Pompeian painting is at its best. Humor is represented, too. A disheveled pedagogue stumbles forward on his staff. A jolly satyr shakes his shanks in sardonic revelry. A bald, ribald Silenus is caught in a mood of musical ecstasy. Taverns and brothels came in for appropriate decoration, and no eager tourist need be told that Priapus still flaunts his precious powers on Pompeian walls. At the other end of the gamut, in the Villa Item, is a series of religious pictures, suggesting the use of the place for celebrating the Dionysian mysteries. In one fresco, a little girl, palsied with piety, reads from an apparently sacred book. In another, a procession of damsels advances, blowing pipes and bringing sacrifice. In a third, a nude lady dances on tiptoe while a neophyte kneels exhausted by some ritualistic whipping. Finer than any of these is a mural found in the ruins of Stabii, presaging Botticelli and called Spring. A woman walks slowly through a garden, gathering flowers. Only her back is seen, and the graceful turning of her head, but seldom has any art conveyed so movingly the poetry of this simple theme. The most powerful of all the pictures recovered from these ruins is the Medea found at Herculaneum, and preserved in the Naples Museum, a brooding woman, magnificently draped, meditating the murder of her children. Apparently this is a copy of the painting for which Caesar paid the artist, Timanicus of Byzantium, 40 talents, or $144,000. Few pictures of such quality have been found in Rome, but in the suburban villa of Livia at Prima Porta, a supreme example was discovered of that landscape painting in which Italy so far excels Greece. The eye is lured as if across a court to a marble trellis, beyond which is a jungle of plants and flowers so accurately reproduced that botanists can now identify and catalogue them. Every leaf is carefully drawn and colored. Birds perch here and there as if for a moment, and insects creep amid the foliage. Only less masterly is the Aldobrandini wedding found on the Esquiline in 1606, and enthusiastically studied by Rubens, Van Dyck, and Goethe. Perhaps it is a copy of a Greek work. Perhaps it is an original by a Roman Greek or by a Roman. We can only say that these figures, the quiet and timid bride, the goddess who counsels her, the mother absorbed in preparations, the maidens waiting to play the lyre and sing, are all done with a delicacy and sensitivity that make this mural a distinguished relic of classic art. Roman painting laid no claim to originality. Greek artists carried with them everywhere the same traditions and methods, and even the vague impressionism of these pictures may be offshoots of Alexandrian skills. But there is in them a fineness of line and a richness of color that explain why painters like Apelles and Protogenes were held in as high repute as sculptors like Polyclitus and Praxiteles. Sometimes the color is as full as if Giorgione had laid it on. Sometimes the subtle gradations of light and shade suggest Rembrandt. Sometimes a crude figure catches the ungainly realism of Van Gogh. Perspective here is often faulty, and hasty workmanship limps behind mature conception. But a fresh vitality redeems these faults. The rhythm of the drapery lures the eye, and the woodland scenes must have been a delight to dwellers in a crowded town. Our taste today is more restrained. We like to leave a wall its own significance, and have hesitated till yesterday to cover it with paint. But to the Italian a wall was a prison, seldom opening through a window upon the world. He wished to forget the barrier and be deluded by art into some verdant peace. Perhaps he was right. Better a pictured tree on a wall than a magic casement's prospect of 1,000 unkempt rooftops blaspheming the sky and festering in the sun. 7. Architecture. 1. Principles, materials, and forms. We have reserved for the climactic edification of our forgotten visitor the greatest of Rome's arts, that in which she most ably defended herself against the Greek invasion, and displayed all her originality, courage, and power. Originality, however, is not parthenogenesis. It is, like parentage, a novel combination of pre-existing elements. All cultures are eclectic in their youth, as education begins with imitation, but when the soul or nation comes of age, it stamps its character, if it has any, upon all its works and words. Rome, like other Mediterranean cities, took the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders from Egypt and Greece, but also she took the arch, the vault, and the dome from Asia, and with them made such a city of palaces, basilicas, amphitheaters, and baths as the earth had not yet beheld. Roman architecture became the art expression of the Roman spirit and state. Boldness, organization, grandeur, and brutal strength raised these unparalleled structures upon the hills. They were the Roman soul in stone. Most of the leading architects in Rome were Romans, not Greeks. One of them, Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, wrote a world classic on architecture, circa 27 BC. Having served as military engineer under Caesar in Africa and as an architect under Octavian, Vitruvius retired in old age to formulate the principles of Rome's most honored art. "Nature has not given me stature," he confessed. "My face is homely with years, and illness has stolen my strength. Therefore I hope to win favor by my knowledge and my book." As Cicero and Quintilian made philosophy a prerequisite for the orator, so Vitruvius required it of the architect. It would improve his purposes while science improved his means. It would make him high-minded, urbane, just, loyal, and without greed. For no true work can be done without good faith and clean hands. He described the materials of architecture, the orders and their elements, and the diverse types of building in Rome, and added discourses on machinery, water clocks, speedometers, more accurately odometers, a peg attached to the axle of the wheel advanced by a cog, a smaller wheel whose much slower revolution caused a pebble to fall into a box, aqueducts, town planning, and public sanitation. As against the rectangular design established by Hippodamus in many Greek cities, Vitruvius recommended the radial arrangement used in Alexandria and modern Washington. The Romans, however, continued to lay out their towns on the rectangular plan of their camps. He warned Italy that in several localities its drinking water led to goiter and declared that poisoning could come from working with lead. He explained sound as a vibratory motion of the air and wrote our oldest extant discussion of architectural acoustics. His book, rediscovered in the Renaissance, deeply influenced Leonardo, Palladio, and Michelangelo. The Romans, says Vitruvius, built with wood, brick, stucco, concrete, stone, and marble. Bricks were the usual substance of walls, arches, and vaults, and served as a frequent facing for concrete. Stucco, too, was often used as a facing. It was made of sand, lime, marble dust, and water, took a high polish, and was laid on in several coats, often to a thickness of 3 inches. Hence it could keep its form for 19 centuries, as in some parts of the Colosseum. In making and using concrete, the Romans were unrivaled until our time. They took the volcanic ash abounding near Naples, mixed it with lime and water, threw in fragments of brick, pottery, marble, and stone, and produced from the 2nd century B.C. onward an opus caementicum as hard as rock and capable of being poured almost into any shape. They cast it, as we do, in troughs formed of boards. By its means they could cover large unsupported spaces with rigid domes free from the lateral thrust of an arched roof. In this way they topped the Parthenon and the great baths. Stone was employed for most temples and the more pretentious homes. One variety from Cappadocia was so translucent that a temple built with it was adequately lighted with all its openings closed. The conquest of Greece brought a taste for marble, which was satisfied first by importing columns, then marble, and finally by working the Carrara quarries near Luna. Before Augustus, marble was largely confined to columns and slabs. In his time it was used as a facing for brick and concrete. Only in this superficial sense did he leave Rome here and there a city of marble. Walls of solid marble were rare. The Romans liked to mingle in the same building the red and gray granite of Egypt, the green cipollino of Euboea, the black and yellow marbles of Numidia, with their own white Carrara, and with basalt, alabaster, and porphyry. Never had architectural material been so complex or so colorful. To the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders, Rome added the Tuscan and composite styles, and certain modifications. Columns were often monoliths instead of superimposed drums. The Doric column received an Ionic base and took on a new, unfluted slenderness. The Ionic capital was sometimes given 4 volutes, to offer the same appearance from every side. The Corinthian column and capital were developed to a delicate beauty beyond any Greek example, but in later decades this style was spoiled by undue elaborations. A like excess poured flowers over the Ionic volutes to make the composite capital, as in the Arch of Titus. Sometimes the volutes ended in animal or human forms, suggestive of gargoyles and presaging medieval forms. The lavish Romans often mixed several orders in the same building, as in the theater of Marcellus. And then again, with perverse economy, they left the side columns attached to the cella, as in the Maison Carrée at Nîmes. Even when the development of the arch had taken from columns their old supporting role, the Romans added them as functionless ornaments, a custom that has survived into our own uncertain age. 2. The temples of Rome. For nearly all her temples, Rome kept the Greek trabeate principle, architraves, that is, master beams, upheld by columns and carrying the roof. Augustus was conservative in art as in everything else, and most of the shrines built by his order clung to the orthodox tradition. From his time onward, the emperors multiplied homes for their Olympic rivals and clothed their lechery with an architectural piety that crowded the hills and blocked the streets with tiled and gilded fanes. Jupiter, of course, was their favorite recipient. Among many, he had one as Jupiter Tonans, the Thunderer, another as Jupiter Stator, who had stayed the flight of the Romans in battle, and he shared with Juno and Minerva the holiest of Rome's sanctuaries atop the Capitoline Hill. There, in the central cell, flanked by a 3-storied Corinthian colonnade, was the gold and ivory colossus of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Jove the best and greatest. Tradition ascribed the first form of this supreme house of Roman worship to Tarquinius Priscus. It was several times burned down and rebuilt. Stilicho, in A.D. 404, stole its gold-plated bronze doors to pay his soldiers, and the Vandals carried off the gold-plated tiles of the roof. Some fragments of the pavement remain. On the northern summit of the same hill rose the temple of Juno Monita, Juno the monitor or guardian. Here was the Roman Mint, and from its name, of course, comes our word for the root of much ambition. On the south side of the hill was the shrine of Saturn, the oldest god of the capital. The Romans dated its first dedication at 497 BC. 8 Ionic columns and an architrave survive. In the forum at the foot of the hill was the little temple of Janus, god of all beginnings. Its doors were opened only in time of war and were closed but 3 times in Rome's ancient history. At the southeast corner of the forum stood the temple of Castor and Pollux, erected in 495 BC. 3 slender Corinthian columns have come down to us from the reconstruction by Tiberius. They are by common consent the finest columns in Rome. In his own forum, Augustus added a temple of Mars Ultor, the Avenger, vowed before Philippi. 3 of its majestic columns stand. One end of its cella was a semicircular apse, an architectural form destined to become the chancel of early Christian churches. On the Palatine, Augustus built entirely of marble a sumptuous temple to Apollo for the god's help at Actium. He adorned it with sculptures by Myron and Scopas, added a splendid library and an art gallery to its enclosure, and did all he could to make men feel that the god had left Greece for Rome and had brought with him the spiritual and cultural leadership of the world. It was even whispered by Augustus's friends, now that his mother was safely dead, that Apollo, disguised as an agile snake, had begotten the subtle prince. In the northwest part of the city was a great shrine to Isis, and on the Palatine a spacious sanctuary for Cybele. Handsome shelters were provided for personified abstractions, health, honor, virtue, concord, faith, fortune, and many more. Nearly all of these contained galleries of statuary and painting. In his great temple of peace, Vespasian gathered for the general eye many of the art treasures of Nero's golden house and some of the relics of Jerusalem. The temple of Fortuna Virilis, in the Forum Boarium, has the distinction of being the most completely preserved of the pre-Augustan buildings in Rome. The ladies of the capital frequently worshipped there, for the goddess, they believed, would teach them how to conceal their defects from men. To these and 100 other temples in the classic rectangular style, the architects of Rome added several circular temples, which revealed a new mastery of the problems presented by a dome. Tradition derived this type from the round hut of Romulus, religiously preserved on the Palatine for many centuries. Almost as old was the pretty Ides Vestae, or House of Vesta, near the temple of Castor and Pollux. Its circular cella, faced with white marble, was enclosed by handsome Corinthian columns, and its roof was a dome of gilded brass. Adjoining it was the Palace of the Vestals, 84 rooms built cloister-wise around a peristyled court, the Atrium Vestae. The Pantheon was not yet a circular temple. As built by Agrippa, it was rectangular, but had a circular plaza before it. Hadrian's architects raised over this space the round temple and mighty dome, which are still among the bravest works of man. 3. The Arcuate Revolution. Rome was greater in her secular than in her sacred architecture, for here she could escape the bondage of tradition and unite engineering with art, utility and power with beauty and form, in a manner all her own. The principle of Greek architecture had been the straight line, however delicately modulated as in the Parthenon, the vertical column, the horizontal architrave, the triangular pediment. The principle of specifically Roman architecture was to be the curve. Romans wanted grandeur, audacity, size, but they could not roof their vast buildings on rectilinear and trabeate principles except by a maze of impeding columns. They solved the problem with the arch, usually in its rounded form, with the vault, which is a prolonged arch, and with the dome, which is a rotated arch. Perhaps Roman generals and their aides had brought from Egypt and Asia a growing familiarity with arcuate shapes, and had reawakened early Roman and Etruscan traditions long overwhelmed by orthodox Greek styles. Now Rome employed the arch on so great a scale that the whole art of building took from this form a new and lasting name. By laying a web of brick ribs along the lines of strain before pouring concrete into the wooden frame of the roof, the Romans developed the articulated vault. By crossing 2 cylindrical or barrel vaults at right angles, they produced a network of ribs and groins that could sustain a heavier superstructure and bear more lateral thrust. These were the principles of Rome's arcuate revolution. It was in the great baths and amphitheaters that the new style reached its completion. The baths of Agrippa, Nero, and Titus were the first of a long series that culminated in the baths of Diocletian. They were monumental buildings of concrete faced with stucco or brick and rising to majestic heights. The interiors were richly decorated with marble and mosaic pavements, varicolored columns, coffered ceilings, paintings, and statuary. They were equipped with dressing rooms, hot and cold baths, an intermediate room of warm air, swimming pools, palestras, libraries, reading rooms, research rooms, lounges, and probably art galleries. Most of the chambers were centrally heated by large clay pipes running under floors and within the walls. These thermae were the most spacious and sumptuous public buildings ever erected, and they have never been equaled in their class. They were part of that socialism of recreation with which the Principate excused its growing monarchy. This same paternalism built the greatest theaters in history. Those of Rome were much fewer but larger than those of modern capitals. The smallest was that which Cornelius Balbus built in the Field of Mars in 13 BC, seating 7,700. Augustus rebuilt Pompey's theater, seating 17,500. He completed another, named for Marcellus, seating 20,500. Unlike Greek theaters, these were walled, and the stands were supported by arched and vaulted masonry instead of resting on the slope of a hill. Only the stage was roofed, but often the audience was sheltered from the sun by a linen awning, or velarium, which in Pompey's theater covered a space 550 feet wide. Over the entrances were boxes for dignitaries and magnates. Some stages had curtains, which, when the play began, were not raised aloft, but lowered into a groove. The stage was elevated some 5 feet. Its background usually took the form of an elaborate building, which, extending from wing to wing, helped the actors to throw their voices out over the immense audiences. Seneca speaks of stage mechanics who invent scaffolding that goes aloft of its own accord, or floors that rise silently into the air. A change of scene was effected by revolving prisms, or by moving a set into the wings or into the loft, thereby exposing the next. Acoustics were aided by sinking hollow jars into the floor and walls of the stage. The auditorium was cooled by rivulets of water running along the passages. Sometimes a mixture of water, wine, and crocus juice was conducted by pipes to the highest tiers and thence scattered over the audience as a perfumed spray. Statues adorned the interior, and large pictures were painted as scenery. Probably no theater or opera house in the world today could equal the size and splendor of Pompey's. More popular still were the circus, the stadium, and the amphitheater. Rome had several stadiums, used chiefly for athletic contests. Horse or chariot races and some spectacles were presented at the Circus Flaminius in the Field of Mars, or more usually at the Circus Maximus, as rebuilt by Caesar between the Palatine and Aventine hills. This was an immense ellipse, 2,200 feet long and 705 feet wide, with wooden seats on 3 sides for 180,000 spectators. We may judge the wealth of Rome by noting that Trajan rebuilt these seats in marble. By comparison, the Colosseum was a modest structure, seating only 50,000. Its plan was not new. The cities of Greek Italy had long since had amphitheaters. Curio, as we have seen, composed one in 53 BC. Caesar built another in 46, Statilius Taurus another in 29 BC. The Flavian amphitheater, as Rome called the Colosseum, was begun by Vespasian and finished by Titus in AD 80. The architect's name is unknown. Vespasian chose as its site the lake and the gardens of Nero's Golden House between the Celian and Palatine hills. It was constructed of travertine stone in an ellipse 1,790 feet around. Its external wall rose 157 feet and was divided into 3 stories, the first partly supported by Tuscan Doric, the second by Ionic, the third by Corinthian columns, with an arch in each intercolumnar space. The main corridors were roofed with barrel vaults, sometimes crossed in the style of medieval cloisters. The interior was also divided into 3 tiers, each upheld by arches, divided into concentric rings of boxes or seats, and cut by stairways into cunei, or wedges. The aspect of the interior today is that of a mass of masonry into which some giant artisan has cut the arches, passages, and seats. Statues and other decorations adorned the whole, and many rows of seats were in marble. There were 80 entrances, 2 of them reserved for the emperor and his suite. These entrances and the exits, or vomitoria, could empty the gigantic bowl in a few minutes. The arena, 287 by 180 feet, was surrounded by a 15-foot wall topped with an iron grating to protect brutes from beasts. The Colosseum was not a beautiful building, and its very immensity reveals a certain coarseness as well as grandeur in the Roman character. It is only the most imposing of all the ruins left by the classic world. The Romans built like giants. It would have been too much to ask that they should finish like jewelers. Roman art had taken over in eclectic confusion the Attic, Asiatic, and Alexandrian styles, restraint, immensity, and elegance. It never quite combined them into that organic unity which is one requisite of beauty. There is something oriental in the crude strength of the typically Roman buildings. They are awe-inspiring rather than beautiful. Even Hadrian's Pantheon is a structural marvel rather than an artistic whole. Except in certain moments, as in the Augustan reliefs and the glass, we must not look here for delicacy of feeling or refinement of execution. We must expect an engineer's art that seeks the perfection of stability, economy, and use, a parvenu's infatuation with immensity and ornament, a soldier's insistence on realism, a warrior's art of overwhelming force. The Romans did not finish like jewelers because conquerors do not become jewelers. They finished like conquerors. Without doubt, they created the most influential and fascinating city in history. They made a plastic, pictorial, and structural art that every man could understand, and a city that every citizen could use. The free masses were poor, but in some measure they owned much of the wealth of Rome. They ate the corn of the state. They sat at almost no cost in the theaters, the circuses, the amphitheaters, and the stadiums. They exercised, refreshed, amused, and educated themselves in the baths. They enjoyed the shade of 100 colonnades and walked under decorated porticos that covered many miles of street and 3 miles in the field of Mars alone. Never had the world seen such a metropolis. At its center, the tumultuous forum busy with business, resounding with oratory, alive with empire-shaking debates, then a ring of majestic temples, basilicas, palaces, theaters, and baths, in a profusion without parallel, then a ring of humming shops and teeming tenements, still another ring of homes and gardens, again with temples and public baths, and last of all a circle of villas and estates pushing the city into the countryside and binding the mountains with the sea. This was the Rome of the Caesars, proud, powerful, brilliant, materialistic, cruel, iniquitous, chaotic, and sublime. Chapter 17. Epicurean Rome, 30 BC to AD 96. 1. The people. Let us enter these dwellings, temples, theaters, and baths, and see how these Romans lived. We shall find them more interesting than their art. We must at the outset recall that by Nero's time they were only geographically Roman. The conditions that Augustus had failed to check, celibacy, childlessness, abortion, and infanticide among the older stocks, manumission and comparative fertility among the new, had transformed the racial character, the moral temper, even the physiognomy of the Roman people. Once the Romans had been precipitated into parentage by the impetus of sex, and lured to it by anxiety for the post-mortem care of their graves. Now the upper and middle classes had learned to separate sex from parentage, and were skeptical about the afterworld. Once the rearing of children had been an obligation of honor to the state, enforced by public opinion. Now it seemed absurd to demand more births in a city crowded to the point of redolence. On the contrary, wealthy bachelors and childless husbands continued to be courted by sycophants longing for legacies. Nothing, said Juvenal, will so endear you to your friends as a barren wife. Crotona, says a character in Petronius, has only 2 classes of inhabitants, flatterers and flattered, and the sole crime there is to bring up children to inherit your money. It is like a battlefield at rest, nothing but corpses and the crows that pick them. Seneca consoled a mother who had lost her only child by reminding her how popular she would now be, for, with us childlessness gives more power than it takes away. The Gracchi had been a family of 12 children. Probably not 5 families of such abundance could be found in Nero's age in patrician or equestrian Rome. Marriage, which had once been a lifelong economic union, was now, among 100,000 Romans, a passing adventure of no great spiritual significance, a loose contract for the mutual provision of physiological conveniences or political aid. To escape the testatory disabilities of the unmarried, some women took eunuchs as contraceptive husbands. Some entered into sham wedlock with poor men on the understanding that the wife need bear no children and might have as many lovers as she pleased. Contraception was practiced in both its mechanical and chemical forms. If these methods failed, there were many ways of procuring abortion. Philosophers and the law condemned it, but the finest families practiced it. Poor women, says Juvenal, endured the perils of childbirth and all the troubles of nursing, but how often does a gilded bed harbor a pregnant woman? So great is the skill, so powerful the drugs of the abortionist. Nevertheless, he tells the husband, "Rejoice, give her the potion. For were she to bear the child, you might find yourself the father of an Ethiopian." In so enlightened a society, infanticide was rare. The infertility of the moneyed classes was so offset by immigration and the fecundity of the poor that the population of Rome and the empire continued to grow. Belloc estimated it at 800,000 for the Rome of the early empire, Gibbon at 1,200,000, Marquardt at 1,600,000. Baloc computed the population of the empire at 54 million, Gibbon at 120 million. The aristocracy was as numerous as before, but it was almost wholly altered in origin. We hear no more of the Aemilii, Claudii, Fabii, Valerii. Only the Cornelii remained of the proud clans that, as late as Caesar, had strutted their Rome. Some had vanished through war or political execution, others had faded out through family limitation, physiological degeneration, or an impoverishment that had lowered them into the plebeian mass. Their places had been taken by Roman businessmen, Italian municipal dignitaries, and provincial nobles. In AD 56, a senator declared that most of the knights and many of the senators were descendants of slaves. After a generation or two, the new optimates adopted the ways of their predecessors, had fewer children and more luxuries, and surrendered to inundation from the east. First had come the Greeks, not so much from the mainland as from Cyrenaica, Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. They were eager, clever, facile semi-orientals, many of them small traders or import merchants, some of them scientists, writers, teachers, artists, physicians, musicians, actors, some sincerely, some venally devoted to philosophy, some of them able administrators and financiers, many of them without moral scruple, nearly all without religious belief. The majority had come as slaves and were not an ideal selection. Freed, they kept their external servility, their internal hatred and scorn of the rich Roman who lived intellectually on the cultural leavings of ancient Hellas. The streets of the capital were now noisy with restless and voluble Greeks. The Greek language was more often heard there than the Latin. If one wished to be read by all classes, he had to write in Greek. Nearly all the early Christians in Rome spoke Greek, so did the Syrians, the Egyptians, and the Jews. A large colony of Egyptians, traders, artisans, artists, lived in the field of Mars. Syrians, thin, affable, shrewd, were everywhere in the capital, busy with trade, handicrafts, secretarial work, finance, and chicanery. The Jews were already in Caesar's time a substantial element in the population of the capital. A few had come as early as 140 B.C. Many had been brought to Rome as war captives after Pompey's campaign of 63 B.C. They were rapidly emancipated, partly by their industry and thrift, partly because their strict adherence to their religious customs was inconvenient for their masters. By 59 B.C., there were so many Jewish citizens in the assemblies that Cicero represented opposition to them as political temerity. In general, the Republican Party was hostile to the Jews, the populares and the emperors were friendly. By the end of the 1st century, they numbered some 20,000 in the capital. They lived mostly on the west side of the Tiber, where they suffered periodically from the floods. They worked on the nearby docks, engaged in handicrafts and retail business, and peddled goods through the city. There were some rich men among them, but only a few great merchants. Syrians and Greeks dominated international commerce. Synagogues were numerous in Rome, and each had its school, its scribes, and its gerousia, or senate of elders. The separatism of the Jews, their scorn of polytheism and image worship, the severity of their morals, their refusal to attend the theaters or the games, their strange customs and ceremonies, their poverty and resultant uncleanliness led to the usual racial antagonisms. Juvenal denounced their fertility, Tacitus their monotheism, Ammianus Marcellinus their fondness for garlic. Bad feeling was heightened by the bloody capture of Jerusalem and the procession of Jewish captives and sacred spoils featured in the triumph of Titus and in the reliefs on his arch. Vespasian heaped insult upon injury by ordering that the half-shekel paid annually by the Jews of the dispersion for the upkeep of the temple at Jerusalem should henceforth be contributed yearly to the rebuilding of Rome. Nevertheless, many educated Romans admired Jewish monotheism. Some were converted to Judaism, and several, even of high family, observed the Jewish Sabbath as a day of worship and rest. If we add to the Greeks, the Syrians, the Egyptians, and the Jews some Numidians, Nubians, and Ethiopians from Africa, a few Arabs, Parthians, Cappadocians, Armenians, Phrygians, and Bithynians from Asia, powerful barbarians from Dalmatia, Thrace, Dacia, and Germany, mustachioed nobles from Gaul, poets and peasants from Spain, and tattooed savages from Britain, we get an ethnic picture of a very heterogeneous and cosmopolitan Rome. Martial marveled at the pliable facility with which the courtesans of Rome readjusted their language and their charms to so varied and polyglot a clientele. Juvenal complained that the Orontes, Syria's great river, was flowing into the Tiber, and Tacitus described the capital as the cesspool of the world. Oriental faces, ways, dress, words, gestures, quarrels, ideas, and faiths made up a great part of the city's seething life. By the 3rd century, the government would be an Oriental monarchy. By the 4th, the religion of Rome would be an Oriental creed, and the masters of the world would kneel to the god of the slaves. There were elements of nobility in this motley crowd. It showed its contempt of Nero's mistress Poppaea, when angry senators dared not speak, and it stormed the Senate House to protest the wholesale slaughter of Pedanius Secundus's slaves. The simple virtues of the common man were not wanting in it. The family life of the Jews was exemplary, and the little Christian communities were troubling the pleasure-mad pagan world with their piety and their decency. But most of the inflowing peoples had literally been demoralized by uprootage from their native surroundings, cultures, and moral codes. Years of slavery had destroyed in them that self-respect which is the backbone of upright conduct, and daily friction with groups of different customs had worn away still more of their custom-made morality. If Rome had not engulfed so many men of alien blood in so brief a time, if she had passed all these newcomers through her schools instead of her slums, if she had treated them as men with 100 potential excellences, if she had occasionally closed her gates to let assimilation catch up with infiltration, she might have gained a new racial and literary vitality from the infusion and might have remained a Roman Rome, the voice and citadel of the West. The task was too great. The victorious city was doomed by the vastness and diversity of her conquests. Her native blood was diluted in the ocean of her subjects. Her educated classes were drawn down by the power of numbers to the culture of those who had been her slaves. Much breeding overcame good breeding. The fertile conquered became masters in the sterile master's house. 2. Education. We do not know much of Roman childhood, but we can judge from Roman art and epitaphs that when children came they were loved not wisely but too well. Juvenal interrupts his wrath to write a tender passage on the good examples we must place before our children's eyes, the evil sights and sounds we must keep from them, the respect that we should show them even in the excesses of our love. Favorinus, in a discourse pre-mimicking Rousseau, begged mothers to nurse their babes. Seneca and Plutarch spoke to the same effect, which was slight indeed. Wet nursing was the rule in all families that could afford it, with no evident tragedies ensuing. Early education came from the nurse, who was usually Greek. There were fairy tales beginning, "Once upon a time a king and a queen." Primary schooling was still entrusted to private enterprise. Rich men often hired tutors for their children, but Quintilian, like Emerson, warned against this as depriving the child of formative friendships and stimulating rivalries. Ordinarily, the boy and girl of the free classes entered at the age of 7 an elementary school, accompanied each way by a pedagogus, or child leader, to guard his safety and his morals. Such schools existed everywhere in the empire, even in small country towns. The wall scribblings at Pompeii suggested general literacy, and probably education was then as widespread in the Mediterranean world as at any time before or since. Both the pedagogus and the teacher, ludi magister, or schoolmaster, were usually Greek freedmen or slaves. In Horace's youth and native town, each pupil paid the teacher 8 asses, or 48 cents, monthly. 350 years later, Diocletian fixed the maximum fee for the elementary teacher at 50 denarii, or $20 per month per pupil. We may judge from this the rise of the teacher and the fall of the ass. About the age of 13, the successful student of either sex was graduated into a secondary or high school. Rome had 20 of these in AD 130. Here the scholars studied more grammar, the Greek language, Latin and Greek literature, music, astronomy, history, mythology, and philosophy, generally through lecture commentaries on the classic poets. Up to this point, the girls seemed to have taken the same courses as the boys, but they often sought additional instruction in music and dancing. Since the secondary teachers, or grammatici, were nearly always Greek freedmen, they naturally emphasized Greek literature and history. Roman culture took on a Greek tint, until by the end of the 2nd century almost all higher education was given in Greek, and Latin literature was swallowed up in the general Hellenic koine and culture of the age. The Roman equivalent of our college and university education was provided in the schools of the rhetors. The empire bristled with rhetoricians who spoke for their clients in court, or wrote speeches for them, or gave public lectures, or taught their art to pupils, or did all four. Many of them traveled from city to city, speaking on literature, philosophy, or politics, and giving exhibitions of how to handle any subject with oratorical skill. The younger Pliny tells of the Greek Isaeus, then 63 years old. He proposes several questions for discussion, gives his audience liberty to call for any they please, and sometimes even to say what side of it he should defend. whereupon he rises, dons his gown, and begins. He introduces his theme with great propriety, his narrative is clear, his controversy ingenious, his logic forcible, and his rhetoric sublime. Such men might open a school, employ assistants, and gather a large student body. Pupils entered about their 16th year and paid fees as high as 2,000 sesterces per course. The chief subjects were oratory, geometry, astronomy, and philosophy, which included much that is now termed science. These constituted a liberal education, that is, one designed for a well-to-do freeman, or homo liber, who would presumably have no physical work to perform. Petronius complained, as every generation does, that education unfitted youth for the problems of maturity. The schools are to blame for the gross foolishness of our young men, since in them they see or hear nothing at all of the affairs of everyday life. We can only say that they gave the assiduous student that clarity and quickness of thought which have distinguished the legal profession in all ages, and that capacity for unscrupulous eloquence which marked the orators of Rome. Apparently no degrees were granted in these schools. The student might stay as long and take as many courses as he liked. Aulus Gellius remained till he was 25. Women also attended, some after marriage. Those who wished further instruction went to Athens for philosophy at its bubbling source, to Alexandria for medicine, or to Rhodes for the last subtleties of rhetoric. Cicero spent $4,000 a year maintaining his son in the University of Athens. By Vespasian's time, the schools of rhetoric had so grown in number and influence that the wily emperor thought it advisable to bring the more important ones in the capital under governmental control by paying their head professors a state salary, the highest being 100,000 sesterces, or $10,000 a year. We do not know to how many teachers or cities Vespasian extended this subsidy. We hear of private endowments for higher education, such as the younger Pliny established at Comum. Trajan provided scholarships for 5,000 boys who had less money than brains. By the reign of Hadrian, governmental financing of secondary schools had been adopted in many municipalities throughout the empire, and a pension fund had been set aside for retired teachers. Hadrian and Antoninus exempted the leading professors of each city from taxation and other civic burdens. Education reached its height while superstition grew, morals declined, and literature decayed. 3. The sexes. The moral life of youth was carefully guarded in the girl, leniently supervised in the young man. The Roman, like the Greek, readily condoned the resort of men to prostitutes. The profession was legalized and restricted. Brothels, or lupanaria, were kept by law outside the city walls and could open only at night. Prostitutes, or meretrices, were registered by the aediles and were required to wear the toga instead of the stola. Some women enrolled as prostitutes to avoid the legal penalties of detected adultery. Fees were adjusted to bring promiscuity within the reach of every pocketbook. We have heard of the quarter of an ass woman. But there was now a rising number of educated courtesans who sought to win patrons by poetry, singing, music, dancing, and cultured conversation. One did not have to go outside the walls to find these or other ladies of easy persuasion. Ovid assures us that they could be met under the porticos, at the circus, in the theater, as numerous as stars in the sky. And Juvenal found them in the precincts of temples, particularly that of Isis, a goddess lenient to love. This book is continued on Cassette 2, Side 1.